Omg Tarot.
Don't worry, I won't let an alien imposter take over this podcast. That would be horrifying. And I suppose this time of year, lots of things are horrifying. As a tarot card reader, you're kind of in a unique position. People open up to you in ways they don't open up to others, and you're privy to information that many others are not privy to. Usually, that's a wonderful, guiding, nourishing thing, but sometimes it can go horribly wrong. And today, we're going to read a few stories from fellow professional readers about tarot card readings that have gone horrifically wrong. And, in some cases, so horrifically wrong that they turned out to be actually the best thing that could have happened in that scenario. So gather round, listen in, and perhaps learn something from a few of the reader horror stories I've collected from across my network. And just a heads up before we begin, these are real stories from real readers. However, I've changed their names and any identifying details to prevent any sort of doxing or embarrassment on their behalf or the querent's behalf. So just know these are things that really happened somewhere, but these are not their actual names. Our first story comes to us from a reader that we'll call Sadie. Sadie was doing a reading for a friend who asked her about a family situation. In the reading, Sadie pulled a couple of cards that pointed to money and possessions. She doesn't remember which cards they were precisely, but for the sake of argument, let's safely assume they were probably some pentacle cards. That's not the crux of the story here. She also pulled death, and as we know, the death card isn't literal. But a week later, Sadie's friend's mother-in-law died. Soon after, her friend's husband and his brother began fighting over their mother's possessions. Sadie's friend came back, saying that she couldn't believe how accurate the reading had been. But Sadie never said anyone was going to die, and she even reiterated this to her friend, that she emphasized that the friend was coming into a period of rebirth. But the cards don't lie, and sometimes they can be very literal. Our next story comes from a reader that we'll call Michelle. She shared a voice message. Let's listen to it now.
I've got a spooky story that I'd like to submit to OMG Tarot's Halloween episode that to this day still gives me some chills, but mostly makes me cringe, and I think some of your followers might feel the same way after hearing the story. For context, I don't read tarot cards very often for other people. I use it as a self-divination tool and meditation tool, yada, yada, yada. But everyone pretty much knows that whenever I go away or, I'm having friends over, I always have the cards there or nearby. A few years ago, I was away for a weekend wedding of a close friend of mine who I've known since high school. My husband was in the wedding party. So I was alone at the hotel room getting ready when a mutual friend, one who, we're friendly, we don't talk every day, but we're friends. She moved out of state recently. She sent me a quick text message, was like, hey, are you at the hotel yet? I need help with my eye makeup. If you'd help me, that'd be clutch. And also, did you bring your cards? So I said, yes, of course, on both accounts. Come on by. We'll make some mimosas. We'll beat our faces. It'll be fun. So she gets to the room, we're doing some lighthearted chit-chatting while I'm doing her eye makeup. I ask her, oh, did hubby end up being able to come to the event? Because some context, he works in a field where he's often doing a lot of overtime or being on call. So it's not uncommon for him to miss an event even as major as, a mutual's wedding. And she was like, no, he happened not to be able to make it. And again, didn't bat an eye, nothing like that. So some context for the story that's about to unfold. Eye makeup, we've had another mimosa or two. And when I say mimosa, I mean it's mostly champagne with a splash of OJ. So I'm feeling loose enough that, I would be able to read her cards or feel comfortable enough to read her cards without my imposter syndrome ramping its ugly head. So I hand her the Halloween deck that I have, tell her to shuffle with whatever questions that she has in mind, and then we get to, fanning the cards out and The way that I work is I run my hand above the deck, and whatever feels hot or tingly, I start pulling. I fan out the cards and I ask her, what question did you have in mind? And she said, no major question, just, what does the cards tell or say about what's happening in my life right now? I was like, okay, sure. So I thought, you know what, I'll just pull 3 cards quickly and, we'll go from there. I was kind of thinking of like a past, present, future, but, whatever the story starts brewing, then I'll say it. The first card I pull is the Empress, and the word vomit just comes out. I'm like, oh my God. Again, I don't read for other people, so the word vomit was just like instantaneous. I was like, oh my God, are you trying to get pregnant? Or are you pregnant? She just gets very quiet. And I'm like, okay. And I'm like, and then I quickly just pulled 2 more cards. And it's I'm like cringing already just that talk about it. And then I pull the Lover's Reverse and the Devil. And I'm like, I just like look up at her. I'm like, I just went and pulled 3 more. And I'm already like cringing just thinking about retelling the story now. And I'm like, oh my God, is she pregnant with someone that she cheated on her husband with? I was like, no, that's not right. That doesn't. I pull another card, and what is it? It's the Emperor. I'm like, okay. And I pull another card, and it's the Tower. And I pulled another one. I know I pulled 6 cards. I just don't remember what that 6th card was, because at that point I'm just like, what in the flying fuck's happening? So I just look at her and I ask her, I'm like, is everything okay between you and hubby? Because I'm seeing a major disconnect here, and I'm seeing a potentially an infidelity. Like, someone's cheating on someone, and there's your lives are about to be really uprooted. And I'm just seeing these guys aren't seeing eye to eye, and there's a lot happening. And then this girl bursts into tears, and she's not the type of person. Well, she didn't really burst into tears. Like, she slowly started shedding tears because she's like this hardened Jersey girl, and she does not cry for anything, but she started to cry. And I was like, oh my God, what have I done? So I just start cringing inside. I'm like, oh no. This is where it gets spooky in the way that it was chillingly accurate. She tells me she wasn't really ready to tell anyone else. Maybe 1 or 2 people already knew, but her and her husband were separating. But she didn't tell anyone. The main reason why was because she had brought up wanting to have children. And he went berserk and was basically like, absolutely not with you. Very, very harsh. Tears streaming down her face. She was like, I didn't tell anyone that part yet. And I was just like, freaky. It was a very, very freaky moment. And she was like, I don't think that anyone else is involved in this. Like, no one else, I don't think he's cheating on me. It was just, I brought up wanting to start a family, and he just wasn't seeing, us having a family. And I was like, holy shit. I was genuinely in shock at how eerily accurate I was, but it wasn't until a few months later, well, actually probably a year or 2, divorce is finalized, and there's rumors swirling that yes, he was indeed cheating on her, and that it was a major catalyst as to why he left her. Time of the reading, she was convinced that no, there was no other woman, but there was. It's spooky for me because, again, I don't read often for other people, and it was just so scarily accurate, but also it made me cringe because here was my intuition and my cards laying out this girl's dirty laundry that she didn't want me to know. Super awkward, and also weird and eerie, and maybe even a little affirming. Maybe I should read for other people, and to hell with my imposter syndrome. I hope you enjoyed this story. I hope your readers enjoy this story, and happy Halloween.
Thanks for sharing, Michelle. And yeah, as readers, sometimes we can pull up things that the querent isn't quite ready to talk about, or perhaps isn't quite ready to acknowledge. And that reminds me of a horror story from my career as a reader that, well, just give it a listen. It was a night like any other. A cool early November evening on a foggy New Jersey farm. A witchy night market was being held on this foggy New Jersey farm, and I was participating in it. I did what I always do at events like these, sitting under my pop up tent, adorned in fairy lights, waiting for querents to come and choose to sit with OMG Tarot for a reading. And sit with me they did. One woman in particular came and had a seat at my table, and I began her reading as I do any other. Hello. How are you doing tonight? Please start by shuffling the cards and focusing on what you want this reading to be about. It's important to note that at the time, I was doing readings in 15-minute blocks, so I set my phone's timer for 15 minutes with this client, and we began. She wanted to know if things with her boyfriend were going to work out in the long run. So we shuffled, and we pulled 3 cards, and I don't quite remember what they were, but I do remember the message was clear. No, this was a short-term fling. It was not going to become a long-term relationship. It sucks, but that's life. It took us all of 5 minutes to reach that conclusion, and she still had a good 10 minutes on the clock. So she asked to pull 3 more cards to see what other details are part of this story. Totally normal, totally standard, that's what we do. So we pulled 3 more cards, and the following 3 cards reiterated what the first 3 cards said, which was, you guys had your fun, you had your romp, your relationship, but this is not a long-term thing. This was kind of a short-term, flash-in-the-pan kind of relationship. She pondered the now 6 cards on the table for a moment and asked, but I wonder if it's gonna work out long-term. And now I'm sitting there kind of thinking to myself, we have 6 cards saying, no, it won't, but of course, the client is essentially the driver, and I'm essentially just the GPS in the situation. So she ponders the cards a moment longer and states that, well, he is my boss, so it might be a little bit difficult for us to make it work long term. Again, no judgment from me. My role is not to judge, my role is to read the cards. So we sat with that for a moment, and I asked, okay, well, what do we want to do next? We've still got some time on the clock. Do you want to pull another 3 cards to see perhaps what you can expect next? Or do we want to change topics? And she decided to pull 3 more cards. 3 more cards to succinctly answer whether this relationship would end up working out long term or if she should call it quits. So once again, we shuffle and we pull 3 more cards, and new cards came out that added on to the story. Notably, again, I don't quite recall which cards she pulled out specifically, but I do recall that the message was that she doesn't want to make things worse. It's basically in her best interest to return back to the status quo, back to the way things are at home, because there is room to salvage what she has at home. And we sat with that for a moment. And she said, yeah, well, I am married, and so is my boss. So I emphasized, I don't necessarily think all is lost here. I think you can potentially return to your husband and make things work. So she asked, do you think it's going to work out between us long term? And we pulled more cards. And yes, we were starting to get close to time here, but we did have room for 3 more cards, so now imagine we're at about 12 cards laid out on the table. And again, our 4th row of 3 cards, we're emphasizing, no, things are not going to work out long term with your boyfriend. However, if you quit now, and if you want to work on your marriage, you certainly can. That's not completely destroyed. There's room to fix what you've got. And I really tried to emphasize this because I really like to emphasize what the querent can do tangibly. And I like to give my clients as much agency in the situation as possible. I don't like any sort of reading that's like, well, you're doomed. Well, that's how this is gonna go. No, they come for me for insight. And so I really was trying to emphasize the fact that this woman does indeed have agency here, and she can in fact go back to her loving husband if that's what she chooses. So we ponder this set of cards, and we sit for a moment, and then she looks up at me and says, "Well, I guess we'll just never know, will we?" Yeah, I guess we'll just never know. And now this isn't meant to call out or shame anybody, but as a reader, this felt like a horror story for me because I'm trying to do a good job here, and it seems like my querent just isn't getting the message, and perhaps the conditions also played a role. It was freezing that night. I'm not even going to pretend it was a slightly cool November evening. No, it was like 30 degrees out. I was cold. I was just... ugh. And as a reader, you can encounter a lot of horrifyingly uncomfortable situations. What do you do in those scenarios? I think tact and compassion are key. In fact, I think those are two of the most important assets to have in your tarot reader's toolkit. Even when you feel horrible saying what you're saying, and even when you're horrified by the situation you're reading about. People are coming to you for guidance, and in my opinion, the only way to work through these challenging scenarios where you might say something that makes you uncomfortable is to just be as truthful as possible and be as honest as possible. That's a scenario that we run into with our last reader horror stories, and this one comes from a reader that we'll call Amanda. Amanda writes, "When I first started reading for the public during COVID, everyone was wearing masks and we had plastic barriers between the reader and the querent. This story takes place at a local psychic fair. I had a woman sit down and immediately she crossed her arms and said, 'So show me if you're good at this or not.' As you know, a lot of my messages go beyond the cards and involve reading the person, so to speak. She was on lockdown! And I was newer to reading for the public, so my stomach was in knots. But I took a deep breath, shuffled my cards, and the cards started flying out. She kept her poker face as I looked at the cards. The Devil, the Tower, Death, 5 of Cups, 8 of Cups, 10 of Swords. It was a grim group. I looked at her and said, well, I'm not sure if I'm right because the message I'm getting is so specific, but I'm getting a strong feeling that you're in a very dangerous, abusive relationship with someone who's heavily into alcohol, drugs, or both. You present like everything is okay, but you're at your breaking point and don't know what to do, but that's why you're here." She sat there for a solid minute like a statue, uncomfortable as ever. I was like a deer in the headlights, and I chuckled nervously and said, "Unless that's someone else in the room." She leaned into the plastic divider, pulled her mask down, and said, "I never said you were wrong. Keep going." What was undoubtedly a very uncomfortable situation for the reader was perhaps an eye-opening situation for the querent, and seems like this is exactly what she needed to hear that day. Again, the cards don't lie, and in fact, the times when they're eerily, perhaps uncomfortably accurate, are the times we tend to get the most out of them. So don't censor your cards or yourself. That horrifying reading might be exactly what your querent, or you, needed to hear. So that's our roundup of reader horror stories for this spooky Halloween 2024. I hope you enjoyed, and maybe you learned something. Join me next week as we get back into our Major Arcana deep dives, and in the next couple of weeks we're going to be finishing out the Major Arcana. If you want to be notified the second each new episode of OMG Tarot drops, just hit subscribe in Spotify, Apple Podcasts, wherever you get your podcasts. And if you like what you're hearing, give me a good review. It really helps. So, that's it for today. I hope you have a fantastically horrifying Halloween, whether that involves giving out candy, taking your kids trick-or-treating, going out to a bar, going to a party, whatever you end up doing tonight. I hope it's spooktacular.